session. Welcome. My name is Ryan Murphy. I'm a PhD candidate and assistant professor at Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada. I'll be your host for this session, hoping to make it nice and sort of casual, fun, dynamic. I almost put up a fireplace behind me here, a virtual one, just to make it the fireside chat experience real. But alas, I'll leave that for another time. And today we're aspiring to reviewing. So the goal of this session is to, expose and make visible that key cornerstone piece of our hidden curricula. It's kind of one of the ways in which research and scholarship and academia has advanced, is reviewing each other's work. But what does it mean to be a reviewer? What is reviewing, and what should reviewing be? These are the kinds of questions that we're exploring with these sessions. And so, who knows what we'll get out of it. We've brought together some intrepid folks here to join us in conversation. That's Katelyn, Peter, and Ruth. So we'll be inviting them to comment very quickly. And the structure of this session is going to be as follows. So we'll have that fireside chat style interview maybe in the first roughly half hour. And then we'll shift over to discussing with comments and questions from the audience. That's the plan. That doesn't mean, though, that you can't comment in the chat whenever you want to. Please, by all means, if something comes up or if you've got a link to share or something to say, don't interrupt maybe until we've opened up that Q&A, but drop it in the chat. We'd love to see those questions, and we'll be drawing from them when we switch into Q&A mode later. And the last thing is, you might have noticed as you joined, this session is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded or your, anything on your camera feed to be shown, then please shut it off your camera feed, and we'll be editing it lightly and putting it on YouTube for perpetuity to make sure that this resource is available to others afterwards if they couldn't be here. So that's roughly the plan. And with that, I'm going to bring my panelists here, my interviewees, up to the fore. So hello, Peter, hello, Ruth, and hello, Katelyn. Got to find you, Katelyn, in the list. Add pin. And so you've been briefed that this is kind of the first question. I want to kind of do a quick round. I'm going to start with you, Katelyn. I want you to tell us, who you are, where you are, and what makes what did I tell you? What does a high quality review look like? That's what I want you to say as quickly as you can. Let's keep it fast for this first section.
I'm Dr. Katelyn Stenger. I am at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Denver, Colorado. What makes a good review is concise and constructive.
Nice. Ruth.
Hi, everyone. I am Ruth Schmidt. I'm an associate professor at the Institute of Design at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And yeah, I would tend to agree. It should be in the service of bettering the paper itself, and with sort of a clear point of view, but one that recognizes the expertise of the writers themselves.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Peter.
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Jones, associate professor at OCAD University for graduate programs only there. So I'm also the editor-in-chief of the new journal, the Systemic Design Association, Contexts. And I'm now have started this year as a distinguished university professor at Tecnológico de Monterrey in systemic design. They're in the development of their master's curriculum and research there. So I will be reflecting as a new editor, but also as somebody who's been reviewing since my own PhD in 2000. And so that's now over 20, I have a progression of many years of reviewing. And so a good review, I think, is one that informs gaps that are within the manuscript that the authors may not be aware of. So from an editorial perspective, but also from scholarly development perspective, I think there's a quality to a good review that helps not school the author, but to help them through a conversation identify scientific gaps or gaps with or areas that could be have not been fully addressed that could make their one article be more influential if they're if particular questions were resolved, or questions that more experienced readers that are seeing their article for the first time might have. So I think there's a give and take in reviews and in the conversation with the eventual reader of the articles.
Okay, thanks, folks. So that was high quality. What does a good quality review look like? Now, obviously, we got to drop the other shoe, and I'm going to go back in reverse order. Peter, what does a terrible quality, bad quality review look like?
Well, there are many ways in which a review could probably be bad, but one would be too concise. I mean, you don't want to have overly long reviews. It just makes a lot of work for the authors. But just short reviews that criticize an author's work or attempts to reject it with the fewest insights possible, that's difficult for both the editor who's trying to make a decision, and it doesn't give the authors anything to go on. So if an article clearly isn't a fit for a journal, perhaps it's not necessarily bad to say this really isn't a fit and we don't need to explain why. Let the other reviewers at a better, at a journal where it's a fit, because you want a good readership, and if your work has some potential, it should be in a venue where, the right readership is going to see it. And so there is that. But a poor review is one that doesn't give the authors any insight or much help to develop and develop their work, to inform their own conversation with the scientific community. And there are many ways that could be the case. There can also be misleading reviews too, that particular reviewers may have a position already that may come across as a strong take or position on the same topic and may argue in ways that aren't effective. So I think asking questions, revealing other alternative options. I mean, we aren't there to change the minds of the authors, but you can see that kind of negative review sometimes where somebody has a strong negative position and they don't really explain where that's coming from. Instead, it comes across as kind of maybe a pure arrogance. So there are a lot of ways in which a review can be poor.
Okay, thanks for that. Ruth, any expansion or disagreement?
Yeah, no, I think in general, I would tend to agree. I think the hallmarks of a poor review, in the sense that the review itself is not a good one. One is just being, as in some cases, like Peter, you used the word arrogant. There can be a sense of disrespectful kind of communication, right? Where it's sort of, it is not about furthering or bettering the work, but it can be, what you don't want is a review that feels like it's sort of taking personal pot shots or sort of engaging in a way that is belittling or diminishing. And that can come across in a bunch of different ways, either through the suggestions themselves, but sometimes even the language that is used. Without going down a whole rabbit hole, I remember one of my PhD students getting a review that was full of like all caps yelling. It's like, that's not cool. That's not scholarly conversation. So disrespect is kind of a big one. Another, I think, pitfall is when reviewers see something in the paper and they want it to be the paper that they want. And it can then distract from actually critiquing in a thoughtful and effective and generous way, how do we make this paper better? But it can start to lean into how do we turn this paper into something that I think is the right thing. And again, Peter, you sort of touched on this as well. Reviewers are engaged because they have perspective and because they have points of view. That is sort of an essential part of being a good reviewer. But if it tilts too far into sort of shifting the nature of the paper itself so that it is, if those recommendations aren't about bettering the paper you're looking at and they're about something else, that also, it becomes a lot of time-consuming sort of machinations for the author themselves to decide how that may or may not be used.
Right.
So yeah, when it's self-serving, that is not a good attribute.
Thanks. And Katelyn?
Yeah, I would largely agree with what we've discussed, right? Being disrespectful in being unable to really get past the differences in points of view. I think that that's one of the center points that can be really can result in a poor review. The other is lack of care. I don't think we've touched on that, but sometimes reviewers can go through the process and say a 30-minute, 1-hour review is sufficient and miss the context of the actual paper or submission being considered. And I think that's the other area here is there's clarity in terms of like point of view and direction to improve the paper that results in a good review. But what can often happen is a reviewer can be strapped for time. And so the review quality decreases quite rapidly, especially if you get close to these deadlines. You can receive reviews that maybe aren't helpful or maybe aren't even reflective of the actual content itself.
So caring, constructive, concise, not too opinionated. I'm hearing all these things. It makes me wonder, is it, do we think it's hard to do a good review, or is there maybe some sort of principles to use to make sure that we can do an effective review even when we're strapped for time? I don't know. Anybody? I'm just sort of thinking off the cuff here. I'm wondering if anybody has a comment on that. Is it hard to do this right, or is it something that you get lucky at, or what? Is there an element of skill?
I can. Oh,
yeah.
I can sort of jump in with a couple of quick thoughts and then hand it off. I think part of it, yes, there's the time element, definitely, where it takes time to maybe read something first, sit with it, digest it, come back to it again. So it's not necessarily something that can be brute forced. So that time to reflect is definitely useful. There's also sometimes it's a bit of a roll of the dice, like how close your own expertise is to the paper itself, right? So that is the sort of thing where we all have our bodies of expertise, and certainly I would not accept a paper that is too far away, because then I'm not going to be effective or useful. The closer it is to things that I'm genuinely kind of, consider myself an expert in, I can be much more thoughtful and rigorous about what I'm suggesting. So part of it is kind of your own things you have control over. Other things are a little bit sort of further afield, where you do the best you can, but also recognizing that there's going to be a bit of variation there, even in terms of the fit, right? Everyone wants as good a fit as possible, but there's always going to be a little bit of a fluidity there.
Peter, you had something else?
Well, actually, the same point that the fit to your expertise, you may not always know when you're asked to do a review how good a fit the article is going to be to your own expertise, and you might be able to inform parts of it, but not the whole. It's difficult within the review format, the way that they're often now structured with, the editorial systems of the publishers, with these kind of tax form looking, structures where you've got, short form answers. And I often will, if accepting a review, will make sure that I'm actually interested and maybe even excited to review that article, because I think I can contribute to it. So even as an editor, where I'm working the other side of the editorial process and seeking reviews and writing, writing responses to authors with the reviews included, and doing desk reviews all the time, I still take on quite a few more reviews than I should, because there are other literatures that I'm interested in. So I'm seeing, from other literatures where I have some expertise, but maybe not comprehensive. And I think, we all should become aware of where we can contribute. And in those editorial process forms, they're often you might have a place where you enter keywords, but there's no place where you can write a position statement, or you could say, this is where I'm coming from, or you have to, the good reviewer, the thoughtful reviewer needs to consider how I think their review is going to be received. And it's much more helpful if, especially our knowledge is partial, that that we can give a response to the areas that we're well informed about and that we feel more confident in, and to actually then bracket our response. I mean, after all, if it's if the authors don't know who the reviewers are, at least yet, until the article is accepted, there's no, you hope that there's no, they don't realize who the review is coming from, and they aren't going to take that into account. But I think that there's, to know where our knowledge base is, but there should really be a fit to the expertise.
Yeah, on that note, at least some kind of overlapping, whether it's methodological or you have like the kind of same theory or point of view. I think some kind of overlap and expertise is extremely important. And also that I think there's an element of humility within all of it, because each paper is contributing to a new kind of way of doing, thinking, our collective like intellectual contributions. And so there is a part of being like, well, this is outside, but if it's about, if it overlaps enough to the point where I can like provide something critical, constructive, that can actually improve the quality of this paper, and this idea, I think that's what can be really, really important.
Yeah, clearly. So clearly you all kind of agreed on that principle that we should find some overlap. I've also been told, though, that one of the benefits of reviewing is that you kind of have to consume content in order to do it. So as a scholar, you get enriched by reviewing content from other authors that you might not have come across. And by definition, that means it's not sort of in your wheelhouse. So I suppose you wouldn't disagree with the idea that the ideal paper to review is something that is like 80% or 75% in your area of expertise, but maybe has something new. Do you agree, disagree? I'm seeing nodding from Ruth. I'm seeing a shrug maybe from Peter. I'm seeing uncertainty maybe from Katelyn.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I can
please.
go.
Tell me.
I was thinking about how we talked about what makes a bad reviewer, and it's like this disrespect, and I've had to politely decline papers after reading them because I disagreed with the premise of it. Just from an ethical perspective, I couldn't get behind what they were doing in the paper. And that prevented me from looking at the quality of it, at the content, not from a view that's respectful, right? Not from a view that's non-biased, but from a view that's respectful to the content, to the authors. So I'm just thinking about instances where I've had to decline because it might have been like methodologically something I could have reviewed, but the way they applied it, I couldn't agree with, so I had to decline.
So if I can follow up on that, does that imply that I assume that paper will go on to be reviewed by somebody who does agree with it, right?
Yeah,
most likely, yeah. Does that mean you're kind of leaving that question or critique you had, if you can call it a critique, for sort of public discourse? Because one of the neat things about reviewing is that it's kind of a private discourse about the pieces that are going forward. And then there's a public discourse, of course, once it's approved and published and gets past the peer review process. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting in a good conversation here about discourse and also labor. Right, to review is to give labor towards something, and sometimes if it can't be in a constructive way for that particular discourse, right, to Ruth's example, sometimes it's not worth all caps saying back to an author like things that might not be useful for a line of thinking that's valuable, but maybe not something I want to be contributing my time to.
Commentary, Peter, Ruth?
Yeah, if I can maybe build on that a little bit too. There are a couple of interesting things that were surfacing. So first of all, like in Katelyn's example, there is, if we look at the work itself, there is sort of the nature of scholarship, right? Like there are going to be contributions that, hopefully any paper is trying to further. we may individually as scholars and as reviewers decide that, in this case, almost sort of from an ethical or moral angle, that maybe this is sort of not the right fit. So there are going to be certain cases like that. There's also the, like increasingly, and I feel like there was an uptick during COVID, for example, of things like preprints and sort of alternate ways for scholarship to enter into that broader discourse. So that is also an interesting area to think about too, where historically one of the sort of hallmarks or benefits of reviews is that it is anonymized, and that it is the conversation between the author and the reviewers in a way that kind of behind closed doors things can get improved. And I do think it's interesting that they're considering where there may be alternate approaches to that. There's a journal, for example, in the STEM sort of area called eLife, which has been experimenting for about the past year or so with open reviews. So rather than it being something that a reviewer takes and then it gets, through the editor passed along to the writer, everything is on the record, which again, not necessarily better or worse, but just a different way of also thinking about how to have that conversation and what that looks like. And then just one last quick point is that when we think about writing a paper and reviewing a paper, there's so many different ways in which there can be additive and beneficial feedback. So sometimes a paper just may make some interesting points, but is just really poorly structured. Sometimes it is that the premise itself is a little questionable or doesn't make sense. Sometimes it's that it is sort of interesting, but doesn't go very far. It's not a real contribution. So one of the things also I think is that as we're talking about something that feels maybe simple, like, oh, I'm reviewing a paper that somebody sent me, there are actually a lot of different dimensions to how we look at what that contribution could be, should be, and what we might add to it. So it's a ball of yarn where there are a lot of different threads that we can, I think, pull at just in terms of even what it looks like and kind of what the benefits and pros and cons of different models are. And I see Cheryl, thank you, posted a link to that eLife sort of structure in the chat as well if folks are interested.
So eLife reminds me of another platform. I think it's you call it a platform called Octopus. Is anybody familiar? I'm looking at the panelists. Are you familiar with Octopus? Have you heard of it? Octopus.ac. I think it came out of the UK sort of, I don't know, work on trying to rethink how academia and scholarship should be. But the premise, at least, I'm hoping I got the name right. The premise of Octopus is that you publish atomically sort of each component of your work. And so you publish a research question. You publish a methods for that research question. You publish findings or even data that come from that methods. And in addition to that, I believe they also have a publishing peer reviews. So I think the concept is that it's all kind of preprints. It's all, you post whatever you want. And then the idea is that the rich stuff will pick up peer reviews that sort of validate that publicly. So it's similar to the eLife model. But I've heard critiques maybe that doesn't have enough prestige, that approach doesn't have enough prestige. And maybe we can get into the issues of prestige in a later part of this conversation. But thanks.
There are
Cheryl.
so many. Yeah, there are so many different points and ideas that have come up just in the last couple of discussions here. So I'm and so this is what's interesting about taking on scholarly publishing and writing from the position of reviews is that it starts to touch on everything, and it could easily sprawl. But there are a couple of, and I'm glad that Ruth brought up eLife and the kind of alternatives to review processes, because that has been used. I think it's more common in the hard sciences and especially physics. And so actually the main competition to the publisher-led journal publishing model that really dominates scholarly publishing today, and even what we call the open journal publishing, which has led to a lot of predatory journals. And these are because, in complexity, you have some things that seem to move in the right direction, and then there's a counter response where there's some exploitation of the affordances in that new model. So I think eLife is extending what has been done. For example, in archive, which has been used, since since the start of the internet in physics, which has open reviews, open drops of articles. And because in physics, you're basically talking about the experiment. There's not a lot of points of view, and there isn't even a lot of precedent, because we're talking about the experiment and reviewing the findings of the experiment. It really is about what has been discovered in the latest experiment. And if it's a breakthrough, you're probably not going, well, we found some other things here. Well, it wasn't the same experiment. So it's a very different discourse than design, and design and systems have, I think, taken on a lot more of the type of reviewing discourse and the approach to journal publishing as in social sciences. So this has led to a lot of, multi-perspectival approaches, and it also requires perhaps more of a private discussion. And then we'll see in reviews is the third party when you are writing a review. And for those that haven't done a lot of reviews yet, you may wonder, well, what is it that I'm saying in this other point? So there's the communication to the author, there's your own reflection about the work itself. So there's that kind of remote exchange with the author. But then there's the communication to the editors. And in most reviewing platforms, there's private note to the editors about your review or about the work, and then comments to the author. And so that there are times that I'm pushed towards the possibility of rejecting an article, but I may not, and I might have some strong critiques to the author, but then I really encourage the editors to consider, even for the sake of the author, that it may not be the best fit. There's a lot of times, there may be language differences or, not understanding the discipline. And you can check this out as a reviewer by looking at references within the article you're reviewing to see, does it even ever mention the same journal that it's publishing in or other work in that journal? And because there is a kind of a discourse in a journal, or the journal becomes less helpful to the reader. And this is something maybe, Ruth's experience and author metrics ought to consider. We could talk about this a lot, but I think, a good journal creates a discourse, but it also encourages kind of ongoing conversations that will help develop scholars in that discourse. So it's the conversation with the editors is part of helping them make the decision.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Thanks. So we're actually getting into how the scholarship system works in a more fluid way than I thought we would. Peter, I do want to ask you, you recently sort of set up Context, we'll put it that way, Context, the Systemic Design Journal. So given what you just discussed, why didn't you just set up a systemic design preprints system? Why did you go with the model of Context that you and the team around Context did?
Well, this could be another whole discussion. So I'll just be really concise, because there is a short answer to that. And it's that within the SDA, I wanted to create a journal as a conversation that would expand the scholarship in systemic design and to create an open discourse, but at the same time to develop the scholarship. And that takes some care and feeding of the authors themselves. So we have a really strong commitment to bringing up the scholarship through things like the Scholar Spiral and through mentorship, the conference process, the RSD. So we see this all as an ecosystem, which I think is what you can do with what they call a society journal, a journal that's very integrated into the scholarly society. And medical journals are sometimes developed like that, very strongly within their own, knowledge base. But they become very specialized. I mean, medical journals have to qualify in the peer review whether, sometimes, findings in the basic science can be applied to, human beings, or, the level of evidence is appropriate for making certain recommendations. And we don't have that level of consequential findings, but we do have, I think we could create a different type of publishing. We can expand, I think, the publishing ecosystem to include other forms. Cheryl and I have talked about this a lot, but that also takes curating, kind of editing, having a lead editor, and getting, we get a lot of articles that would fit into a more open, almost blog-like process, and we'd like to expand it into something like that too. But I think the real core purpose is expanding the scholarship and quality of scholarship in systemic design as a discourse.
Very cool. So you're kind of, Ruth, I see
oh,
it. Yeah, go ahead.
Apologies, no, finish your thought.
Sure. So it's what I'm hearing from Peter is that it's setting up a sort of reviewing ecosystem is really about kind of the infrastructure and the relationships between all the different actors that you're trying to architect together in a sensible way. And so just creating a sort of place to drop PDFs or abstracts or whatever doesn't do the same kind of care. It doesn't bring that same kind of care where a set of experts or people who have investment in the field can sort of shape this system with the investment that we're doing with contexts. Ruth?
Yeah, it's just building on this in such a an important way. We keep using the word communication and discourse, and I think that really is so important. That's not just a word or even just a metaphor. And maybe I'm biased about this because when I talk to our PhD students, for example, I really describe what they are doing as having a conversation with the past. They are they are part of a conversation that has been started by a field, a discipline, other people there. It's one of the reasons why choosing the right journal makes a difference. It's like, who do you want to be in conversation with? That's an important aspect. You're also having a conversation, you're planting seeds for the future, right? By putting articles and thoughts out into the world in a way that people will grasp and be compelled to look at and read. Hopefully you are, planting seeds for further conversations. It's one of the reasons why I care very deeply about how I write things, and I may be a little old-fashioned in that respect, but like I want to really say the things in the way that I want to say them, in part because it matters to me that I'm holding up my end, both as a reviewer and as a writer in terms of what that is. But it's also just one little note is that many of us, at least on the panel, are within the systems and design community, and we may have certain norms about what a good conversation looks like. I'm not an economist, but my understanding sometimes is that, for example, in the field of economics, a conversation is a lot more contentious, and it's almost like it's a competitive thing. That is part of the nature of how that field engages. And so it's also maybe just a reminder that different fields both obviously have different disciplinary content areas, but also different norms and traditions about what that conversation and dialogue and discourse looks like, right? So it may be what is right in the sciences may not be right for design, and what's right for design may be very different than how economics functions. Is that healthy or unhealthy? Who knows? But it is kind of an aspect, I think, of participating in that disciplinary tradition. The conversation itself, it has a different tenor to it depending on who you are and who you're talking to.
Right. Very cool. I'm going to close up my questions in a moment. But and it's too bad because there's a whole list that I didn't get to. But Katelyn, I did want to switch to you for a moment. You have a call for papers closing in a couple of months. Is that right? Can you tell us? Advertise that for us. Yeah.
So I have a call for papers on social and behavioral sciences, as well as on the energy transition. So thinking about how these two fields kind of overlap and can be applied or can be considered. It's a broad-ranging piece. I was looking to really open up the door of the conversation, speaking about dialogue, open up the conversation in a particularly technical journal. Energy and climate change is extremely, you'll get a lot of things on carbon capture and energy transition. And sometimes those dialogues are happening without really any consideration about people or cultural systems or how we design or policy. And so this special issue is really to create a space for that dialogue, for that discourse. And it spans a couple of different regions, but if you're interested in it, I have more information and I can drop a link in the chat as well. So
please. And so the question that I was going to ask you sort of based on that is there anything that you can bring from your experience in setting that up as your guest editor, right? That's the title.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. How are you how are you thinking about being a guest editor? How does that relate to this conversation?
Yeah, I think, right. I'm like joined with two people who have more experience in different ways. And so I think when being a guest editor, it's an opportunity for a lot of people who have new ideas to start crafting those and who are new to the editor process. There has been so much support from the staff and also from the editorial board on crafting this message, on navigating, just even going through the particular structures that already exists. So I would really highly encourage, if you have an idea that you think isn't, or a conversation that isn't happening, a guest editorship can be a great way of both getting this experience as well as creating a space for a conversation you want to have, right? Like, that's kind of the best part. I get to go through, look for and ask for reviewers from different folks, but also I get to see a big body of work in a very short amount of time.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll post a link if we, okay, Cheryl's already got it. Thanks,
Thank you,
Cheryl. The last question that I'll pose, for the structured question, is this is just like an opportunity for unsolicited, maybe unwanted advice, Katelyn, but I'm wondering if Peter or Ruth have any comments or advice on setting this thing up in the as it's rolling out over the next few months. Anything at all? This is a tough one.
Explain the question a little bit, more.
Yeah,
So are you actually about our process going forward, since this is our only conversation? So you mean, what advice would we have for the process for exploring reviewing?
For guest editing for Katelyn's experience coming up.
Yeah, building on Katelyn's.
Yeah.
I completely agree with her. Yeah, the perspective of getting started in going more deeply into reviewing and getting started in the editorial process by taking on a guest editorship, which also allows you to form a small team where you can learn together with other co-editors. I think that is one of the most valuable parts of the process, is learning from the other perspectives and the experience, especially if you're just wondering about, if you're a recent if you're a recent PhD or early career, this is a very good way to start developing your own relationships with not even so much reviewers, but in the curation of the papers, seeking out the appropriate papers for either a special issue or an edited volume. So, I mean, I've been involved with a lot of Springer or Routledge edited volumes. Because I'm an editor, I get asked to contribute to some of those. We've got one right now led by Marie Sohemo of AHO on systemic service design. And so it had like 30 chapters. We can't take 30 chapters. So the team is working a lot with trying to, this iterative process through the review process of determining the best fits and what fits to systemic service design. What do we mean by it? What really contributes to the precedent? And so there's a really rich conversation that goes on through the whole process with the guest editor team, probably more so in an edited volume than in a special issue of a journal. There's often more structure in the journal, but I'd really recommend the learning that in that process, and that you'll come out of that feeling like you could probably review anything. So it's a very good learning experience.
Very cool. Ruth, any thoughts on that before I switch to Q&A?
I've actually never been a guest editor, so I am Katelyn will teach me things at the end of the process, I suppose.
Deal. Well, actually, let me use this as a sort of alley-oop for your contributions to the Declaration on Research Assessment. Maybe it doesn't bear on Katelyn's direct experience, but I didn't want to escape from the conversation without getting to that a little bit. So do you have any sort of insights to draw from to share with us on your work with DORA and its implications for reviewing?
Yeah, absolutely. And this honestly could be a whole other conversation. For those who aren't familiar with DORA, it stands for Declaration on Research Assessment, and it's an organization or entity that started at this point about a little over 10 years ago, basically recognizing that not just reviewing, but research assessment was in need of reform. It's a sort of thing where within academia, sometimes you'll have a system that is very stable, but not particularly healthy. And this is what Dora kind of recognized. And now there are several other organizations. They're not, by a long shot, not the only one anymore. But recognizing what types of what does impact mean, for example? What does it mean for people who are trying to build a career or advance in academia, and to recognize how things like reviewing, for example, or submitting papers may be shaped in some ways by incentives that are about moving up rather than doing the work one wants to do. So Dora expands far beyond the reviewing aspect, but it's interesting in this context because there is, all of the kind of relationships and interconnections between different players in the academic ecosystem. Journals are a huge part of that. Research institutions, another huge part of that, researchers, another huge part. So it's a bit more of a backdrop to the conversation that we're having. But again, the reason, for example, why eLife to me is an interesting, sort of alternative is not, again, because it's perfect, but because starting to stretch the terms of what does it look like to both do this well, but also to sort of innovate within the space and understand kind of what are different models that may be useful that still demand the same and kind of the same expectations of rigor and prestige, which shouldn't go away, right? So it's a difficult set of questions, but yeah, Dora is one of many organizations that are kind of trying to chip away at least about what can this look like at an institutional level as well as an individual one.
Right. Thanks for sharing. And I apologize to the audience for going over what I was hoping to do by a little bit, but I wanted to make sure we included Katelyn's upcoming CFP and mentioned Dora before we sort of closed off. So Marie, your virtual hand must be getting very tired, but you are certainly the first to raise your hand. Marie,
hello. I just
away?
want to show my strong disagreement with Peter when he said that the paper should cite the journal, which I find kind of like academic corruption, because actually several journals requested. I got once, and it's prestigious journals. It's not like one would expect it from predatory journals, but no, it's a prestigious journal. I got once paper rejected. Your paper is great. Everything is fantastic. You don't cite our journal. We don't accept the submission. With another journal, they actually even dared to do their literature review of their journal, to which papers we could cite in our paper, and asked us to cite it. And I consider it very embarrassing academic corruption, which one would expect from predatory journals, one wouldn't expect from respected journals, but it is happening with respected journals. And I am rather shocked. And I don't think if you fit to the journal, doesn't mean that you need to cite different articles of the journal. You might fit to the call. You might fit to the journal description. And I strongly disagree that is a criterium for acceptance of the paper, that you should cite the journal. I rather find it as a corruption.
Well, I think that's a pretty strong dividing line. As an editor, when you see there's a real range in other journals of what their discourse is going to be. And there are some that are definitely founded, especially like medical research, where the precedent is going to be extremely important. And if you can't show that you know the background in that discourse, then, I mean, no one's going to understand, it's not going to be helpful for the readership. In physics, you can just drop a paper in with an experiment and it doesn't matter what the precedent is. So I think calling it academic corruption is... Huh?
I'm not saying not citing anybody. I'm saying that it doesn't need to be papers from the journal.
Oh, no, no, that's true. But in that, but papers that are within the discourse. So I often do see, I'm an experienced, so I'll give you an example of where this is often the case. There are interdisciplinary journals like Systems, which I am a senior reviewer for, and I'm often asked to qualify as a senior editor and reviewer, and on their board, I'm asked to review work that could be a fit to systems, and we often see papers that just use the word and don't have any systems theory at all. And it's just, and so I won't just reject it. I mean, so that isn't where I'm coming from, certainly. This isn't a fit. But I will say that that it may not be a fit to the readership of that journal, given that it's not informing anything. It is not advancing the discourse that is actually part of that journal. So if it's in a different topic, and we do, this is what I meant.
It might be advancing the discourse that is part of the journal. However, the citations don't need to be from the journal, right?
Oh, no, it's a slippery slope. It depends on the discourse.
So I'm going to
It
pause
really
this
depends on the discourse field.
before we go too far into this rabbit hole. Although I think, Marie, what we're hearing is that arbitrary sort of closing a discourse can probably be seen as corruption. And I personally don't disagree with that. I'm curious if the other panelists have something to say on that. You feel free to jump in, but I do want to highlight some other questions that have been asked in the chat, if that's okay. So sorry, Ruth, were you coming?
Well, just very quickly, and I agree, we should move on. It's again, maybe coming back to this idea of having a conversation. So if it's not necessarily just about kind of racking up points, like that does, you know, there's a certain point where it's just about sort of checking boxes, which doesn't seem cool, but they're being part of the conversation with the journal that you are participating with and having, if it is a meaningful citation that you've missed, that's one thing. It shouldn't just be to kind of accumulate them.
It's
but
meaningful. Exactly.
Definitely frustrating. So there's two sort of concrete questions in the chat. Sanaz has asked if there's sort of an approach or a template that could be used to help you review. Like when you engage in reviewing, do you have a specific set of questions or principles maybe that you sort of go for? So that's one of the concrete questions. And the other one was from Andreas. Can you say something about how you were reviewing the references in a paper that you reviewed? So comment from any of you on either of those.
Well, in terms of I don't know that there's a template that I use so much as sometimes the journals themselves will have a series of questions. So sometimes it's kind of coming from them that there are sort of principles that they want to cover. So that can be a helpful guide. It kind of runs the gamut. They don't all have the same structure, but you know, they tend to cover similar types of things. Like, is the premise acceptable? Do you think this will be a meaningful contribution? Do you feel it's well structured? You know, some of them are more about kind of how it was written, and some are more about the ideas. I think one great way to learn is by doing reviews, and I realize that's sort of a chicken and egg thing because in order to get invited to do reviews, you often need to kind of get on the radar of people who can think of you as an expert. But yeah, no, that's an interesting question, because I don't know that I'm aware, at least, of sort of a third-party version where it's like, this is what a good good review is necessarily. I don't know if others have different experience.
I actually, I really like this reflexivity with the journal, only because certain journals care about certain kinds of things. Sometimes I get invited for more empirical papers that are like a survey methodology or something of the like, and it will be within a journal that is more survey based. So they're very concerned about how the survey was administered. And then the context surrounding it is maybe not as important. Maybe the theory or contributions aren't as important, whereas sometimes more systems design research is really about more contextual research, more like understanding and seeing the system, and also having a nice structure and flow, because it can be hard to figure out where to dive in first. So I think it's really dependent on, again, this discourse that we're talking about. There's these principles of reviewing, but it really can never happen without the context it's happening in. So.
Yeah, I'll agree. I'll say quickly that in response to this, in terms of reviewing the references can be a helpful way, especially if there is a language difference and non-English as first. I do review a lot of papers for some journals that are written by, usually well in English by non-English speaking authors. And there can be a really wide differences in the quality and the breadth of the references that they're using to support claims. And I don't want to get too specific here, but if the support for claims in the paper, particularly in not so much in systemic design. In design, I think the design authors know each other well enough to pick different points of view, but in systems and in transdisciplinary systems and often in healthcare research as well, and other focus areas that I review, I'll see just many gaps, and the references are a place to see where their strength of focus is and what might be missing that really would inform their claims if they knew about it. So it's actually very helpful for the scholarship, for reviewers to identify from the references what things might be missing. And even as an editor, I've had discussions about possible references, not to our journal, Murray, but because there isn't even that much in context yet, it's very new. But that wouldn't even be the case. But I will sometimes say, there's precedent in RSD. And if you're even in context, if somebody's submitting something to context and they don't know, our discourse coming out of 13 years of the RSD symposium, then very often the things that they might be touching on are actually addressed in conference papers, and all of that work is open, all those proceedings, and it is kind of a proceedings driven process, and they are peer reviewed. So there are, so that if there are things that are missing in the references, it can be very helpful for the scholarship. It's not a tool for rejecting a paper, unless it's just nothing or completely off. And so there are times you can tell by the references, they actually don't have a clue, and they may have superficially assessed what they think might actually get themselves published. So as reviewers, you also have to look for disingenuous papers. I mean, there's a lot of competition. Everyone wants to get published. There are a lot of, there's a lot coming in from around the world, and you'll see things that just are they may be well written, but just very badly sourced, cited, and claimed. So, I mean, that's, I think, very important part of reviewing.
I would also like to build on that, only because I see oftentimes practitioners who have a lot of knowledge about how things work in the field and how things are happening. And there's this gap for conference paper writing. And so actually when I'm reviewing conference papers, I'd almost take a more like a different approach to how I review, right? That's a learning opportunity. That's hey, this person might not have formal training in this, but has really key insights that are going to advance how we think about this. And so it's an opportunity for investment in community and also in who gets to share what contributions we have, particularly in the conference space where people are starting to develop some of these ideas and insights.
I will add, I know that there's lots of sort of scholarship on reviewing out there, so you can sort of, if you were, one thing that I'm taking for this conversation is that it's neat to think about what my theory of reviewing is, right? Like, what am I trying to get out of it? And I know that I can look up guides and such if I want. One thing I got concretely from this conversation, from what you all have shared, is that there's kind of like a tiered level to reviewing. You kind of need to first look at it at an overall state and decide if it's like an ethics or a care issue that you need to sort of engage in. Like, do you deserve or should you be the one to address this particular paper? And then under there's probably like is there a real contribution? What is the contribution? And I know mathematician G.H. Hardy has proposed that there's a pretty simple rubric for that. Is it new? Is it true? And is it useful? So that's one approach that I use. And then the third is sort of the editing, the like how well written and how well communicated is this? So maybe there's a structure there. John, I see your hand is up, and I will note, I know Ruth, you have to run. You have a call in a couple minutes, so if you have to drop out, feel free. Let's jump to John's, and but before we do that, John, thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you, Peter, and thank you, Katelyn. Just in case this next conversation runs over, John, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, right on. Thanks. I guess one observation there is about, I guess, the context of the person submitting. I know that I'm a mostly industry person who's submitting some entries that I kind of, hope are rejected with useful citations so that I could submit them again next year. And I'm kind of wondering to what degree the reviewers think of that as favorable and how much context about, what the student is trying to accomplish, whether they're really, a student desperately to publish to get on to their next thing, or there's somebody from industry coming from outside, or how much that really kind of might play into kind of how they practice the whole reviewing game.
Oh, did Ruth jump off? I think she had to. Yeah. I think that's a great insight, John. I really, speaking as a reviewer and as a reviewer for papers that, may often come out of practitioners introducing work at a conference and taking that further. I think that kind of the unique and surprising development of other ideas, other references, and other, other citations that are thoughtfully supporting a good paper are a thrill to read. They really can advance things if that's done well. I think my point was a lot of times it's just so superficial or just so filled with gaps. We more typically see less thoughtful work that is just kind of missing the point. But and I'm not sure that all academic reviewers would see it in the way that you're presenting it, John. And I think it's more those of us who've been trained in an interdisciplinary fields or have worked transdisciplinary across disciplines are perhaps more sensitive and inclined to see the types of insights that might come from more occasional authors, but sometimes those papers can have so much influence and be just a thrill to review and support and see the attention develop around them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I really love this idea of how it's some venues can be opportunities for really showcasing new ideas. Peter, you mentioned this ecosystem of reviewing and of crafting of both a culture, really cultivating a culture around like what kinds of conversations are had. And I think that's true across all disciplines, right? Sometimes like energy justice, if that was like the headline, and nature sustainability 10 years ago, like that dialogue hadn't really been built out in the way it has been today. And so when we think about different kinds of things, there's a reason we say like standing on the shoulders of giants, in terms of like how these dialogues get built up over time and investing in the conversations, investing in the review process. One thing I will say is there is a marked shift in how we think about the literature, I would say in like probably the last 20, 30 years. And the big change there is it used to be more that we'd search for things, right? That knowledge is apprehendable and that it's discrete and we can pull it off the shelf. And right now, I think we're more living in an ocean of knowledge where there are many different things and there are many different disciplines blending together. And it's more about navigating that rather than searching and finding something. So.
Okay, thanks to you both. With that, I think we will call it to a close. It seems like a nice closing point. Again, thanks so much to Peter and to Katelyn and to Ruth who had to go for your attention and care here, right? There's a rich conversation that we'll be capturing in the chat. Feel free to sort of look through it for links before you go if you want. I can stick around for a few minutes if somebody wants to sort of have an offline chat. We'll shut off the recording. And other than that, I think that's it. Come on tomorrow if you're available, and if the time zone doesn't hurt you too much. Cheryl's posted a link in the chat, but we're doing this again with a different audience, with Ray Eisen. I'm looking for the names: Ray Eisen, Huda Kamei, and Wendy Ross. So thanks again for everybody to attend.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.